Chapter 6. Tamret saved me. She leapt up and plucked me out of the sky. She probably could have saved Ardov too, but she didn't bother. Maybe she knew Steve was going to grab him, maybe not. "I've got you," she said, but her voice lacked the glee I'd come to expect when she saved me from one of my stupid mistakes. Maybe she was angry with me for getting drawn into Ardov's trap. Maybe she was worried about how much danger we were in. I was worried about all those things too, but I was relieved she had been there for me. "Thank you," I said. "Thank me later." She landed hard on the ground and unceremoniously rolled me out of her arms. I found my footing, just barely. I felt wobbly, like after a carnival ride that spins you around. Charles was at the entrance to the ship, waving us in. "Alice is on board. We must go." I felt like vomiting and passing out, and I was more than a little freaked out about not being able to activate my HUD, but I managed to propel myself forward. Steve was at the controls, and he didn't wait for me to stop staggering, or even for the doors to close, before he began to lift off the ground. "Everyone not strapped in might want to grab onto something," he said. I managed to take hold of a metal ring, possibly designed for the exact purpose, just as I was thrown to a near horizontal, like a flag in the wind. Steve simultaneously turned hard and accelerated. The dampening fields hadn't kicked in yet, and without them, traveling at these speeds was going to feel like being flung through space inside a hollow cannonball. The effect didn't last long, though. We began to level out around the time we exited the atmosphere. I looked over and was relieved to note that the door was now closed. "We've got fads on our tail, and it'll be a minute before we can tunnel," Steve shouted. "I need to keep them distracted. Zeke, you want to take the weapons console?" I wanted to be able to step up, but I felt like I'd just been rattled around inside a jar for 5 minutes. Besides which, my upgrades were still not functioning. Anyone with the former skills, even someone who had never seen a weapons console before, would be faster and more accurate than I could be right now. "I can't do it," I said, shaking my head as I slipped down to the deck. I was still nauseated and dizzy, and I put my head between my knees to keep myself from puking. Before I did that, though, I managed to catch a look cross Steve's reptilian face. Concern? Disappointment? Without a word, Charles sat down at the weapons station and began to lay out a barrage of suppressive fire at lightning speed. I glanced up at the monitor, showing the aft view, and saw Phatic cruisers spiraling wildly as they tried to avoid our PPB blasts. I wasn't getting the job done, and that felt terrible, but the job was getting done, and maybe that was all that mattered. In another few seconds, Steve was able to open the tunnel aperture. The disorientation that accompanies dropping out of relativistic space was more than I could handle. And at the very moment our ship violated the laws of ordinary physics and we punched a hole through the fabric of reality itself, I barfed on my shoes. One thing I will say for the fads, as a species of recreational pukers, they know how to clean up their messes. Little robots appeared out of nowhere and scrubbed the floor while nanites broke down my upchuck into a molecular mist. A brief spray of something citrus-smelling misted up from the floor. No harm, no foul. By the time these machines had finished their work, my nausea had started to ease up. So it was time to take stock of the situation. I could now deal with exciting developments like Ardov being along for the ride. Hooray. He was currently unconscious, and his wrists and ankles were bound with blue plasma cuffs that someone had generated. I knew that even with his enhanced strength, he couldn't break out of them, but somehow that didn't make me feel any better about having him around. I wouldn't breathe easy until he was off the ship, preferably locked in the Phantom Zone, though I'd settle for a concrete bunker at the bottom of an ocean of a distant planet somewhere. As bad as that was, there were even more serious issues to contend with. Alice was unconscious, lying on the deck of the ship, with Dr. Roop and Charles hovering over her, looking disturbingly doubtful. There was also the matter of my upgrades being offline, but I would deal with that later. I went over to where they had set Alice, some blankets under her head. Her eyes were closed, and her skin had become pale and slightly waxy looking. "What's wrong with her?" I asked. Besides all the other terrible things I was feeling, I could now add guilt. Alice had wanted out. She had been willing to see us to the ship, but then she planned to go find her dad. Now we were taking her away from Earth against her will. We didn't have much of a choice, but I still felt terrible about it. Dr. Roop shook his head.
I'm not entirely sure. When Ardov awakens, he may be able to provide us with more information, though I doubt he will choose to be cooperative. As near as I can tell, the weapon disoriented the operations of Alice's nanites while simultaneously transmitting data about their function back to the Fads. I do not know if the weapon was meant to harm her or if that was an unintended side effect. However, the projectile that struck her did considerable damage, and now her metabolism appears to be slowing at an alarming rate.
Is she going to die? I asked.
If the process does not stop, or if we do not find a way to stop it, then yes.
How long does she have?
A week, perhaps,
he said, shaking his head.
Maybe less.
That was not good. I told myself there was good reason to hope we could restore order to the cosmos within a week. We could get Alice to a friendly Confederation hospital and have the best medical minds in the galaxy working to help her. I hated the idea of putting her health on hold, but I wasn't sure what else we could do. Until we solved some bigger problems, there was no safe harbor we could take her to. At least not that I knew of.
How could they know how to do this?
Charles asked.
We haven't even begun to understand our abilities. It seems that they have begun to understand them,
Dr. Roop said.
Remember, Zeke's father stole the code for the military tech tree after the Fads uncovered it. They have already had a chance to study it at length.
Then, why did they need to get the data from us? I asked.
Because we hacked the system and learned how to maximize the available abilities,
Dr. Room explained. Tamret, who had been working the navigation panel, turned around and held up her furry hands in protest.
Look, I know I'm good, but I'm just one girl. I can't believe that in all of the Fatic Empire, they can't find someone who could pull off what I was able to do pretty quickly, and while under a lot of pressure.
I have no doubt that they have tried,
Dr. Roop said.
But remember, Tamret, you hacked a particular version of the code, and you did it from a former computer. There were almost certainly avenues and backdoors available from that console that would not be found elsewhere. It is also true that, as adolescents, your brains are more pliable than those of adults. You see things differently, and that may have helped you exploit elements in the former code. Then why do the Fads not use their own young hackers to crack the code?
Charles asked.
They may not have any,
Dr. Roop said.
Theirs is not a society that tolerates beings such as Tamret, who do not flinch at breaking the rules in order to do what is right. And even if they did have hackers, using adolescents for such a purpose would not have occurred to the Fads. You will recall they regard young beings as barely even sentient.
So, before all this,
Misan said,
we had an advantage that we've now lost.
Yes, they must have had their suspicion, which is why they tried to isolate Tamret's nanites.
He glanced at her, and she shrugged.
They put something in my food and made me fall asleep. When I woke up, I was in that lab, unable to move. I guessed what they were after, and I just sort of figured out a way to keep them from being able to get a hold of my working nanites.
Dr. Roop nodded.
On Confederation Central, you experimented with hacking your own skill tree long before altering anyone else's. They must have assumed that you, of all the prisoners, would be most likely to have hacked the version of the former tech tree. Maybe they knew your blood yielded nothing, maybe not, but then Zeke and the others demonstrated their abilities at the school, and they decided to try and get information from the other humans.
So, I handed them exactly what they needed, I asked.
You could not have known,
Dr. Roop said, his voice kind. I should have known, I said. Ardov lured me into a fight, and I walked right into his trap. I should have gotten Alice back to the ship right away. Now we've given an advantage to the enemy. Alice might die, and I'm broken. My upgrades don't work. I can't even access my HUD. Dr. Roop looked at me and blinked sympathetically. which didn't make me feel good about my prospects.
We have already realized that this is the case. Your falling from the sky alerted us to the error, and we ran some medical scans on you immediately.
Then you've been looking into it? I asked. Tamrat nodded. I looked at her. Can you fix this? She let out a breath and her ears flattened.
I don't know. Right now we have no idea what went wrong with you. We don't understand why your abilities have gone dark, or if it could happen to the rest of us. I've downloaded all your data, and I'm comparing it to the rest of us, but it may be a while before we can learn anything. You can still understand our languages, which means your nanites are still there and partially working, but beyond that you don't seem to be gaining any benefits from either the original or the former upgrades.
I would not read anything into the translation ability continuing to function,
Dr. Roop said.
They have always been separate systems. That is why when you first were exiled from the Confederation, it was easy for me to keep your translation nanites working, while temporarily neutralizing everything else.
It was bad news, but it could have been worse. Not being able to understand any of the aliens on the ship would have been a disaster. The fact that I'd been in a similar situation before and clawed my way back gave me some hope. I made a decision not to get upset. We were going to fix this, not accept it. Okay, so what's the plan?
The plan remains unchanged,
Dr. Roop said.
The original approach is still the only option we have, both for removing Junip from power and for saving Alice's life. We are on our way to rendezvous with Captain Quassel. She has been using her time to search for former artifacts. Perhaps her efforts have revealed new technology that will help defeat the Fads. Regardless, we need her ship and her expertise. Once we are on board, we will go to the planet where they are holding Director Gliwixix and the others.
I nodded. Do we have a plan for what we do once we get to the prison?
I'm afraid there is no we,
said Dr. Roop.
Not for you. You cannot participate in any operations. You and Velonic, with no former abilities, are too vulnerable.
I stood there, unable to speak. After everything we'd been through together, it had never occurred to me I might be sidelined for the most important operation my friends had ever attempted. I understood the reason, of course. I would be virtually helpless, a liability to the rest of the supergroup. I knew I had nothing to offer, but even so, it stung. Isn't that just perfect? Said Ardov, who was now awake. He leaned against the bulkhead, his arms bound behind him, his legs spread out with his feet manacled. Poor little Zeke getting kicked out of the club. But now, at least I know what you're up to. Director Junip asked me to find out, and now I have. Is he transmitting? I asked the group. I felt so powerless. I hadn't been using the former skills very long, but they'd become almost second nature in a short amount of time. Now, I felt like I was missing a sense. Maybe all my senses.
Not a chance,
Steve said.
There is no data coming in or out of the ship. We're in tunnel, which means communications are a no-go, but even if we were in normal space, it wouldn't matter. We're on full communication blackout.
We'll have to keep it that way, Misan said. We need about 5 layers of redundancy on his restraints if we want to keep him from breaking free. And that means we can't maroon him anywhere until we've completed the operation. Dr. Roop walked over to him.
Perhaps you can tell us how your weapon is harming our companion.
He managed to shrug. They gave it to me and told me to shoot her, so that's what I did. Other than that, I have no idea, but I'm glad it's messing her up.
If he cannot help us, Charles said, then I think he should be rendered unconscious for the remainder of the voyage. I agree, Dr. Roop said. Are you willing to cooperate? All we want is to help our friend.
One more of you running around wouldn't make a difference to me, he said. I'd tell you how to help if I could. Let's find some other reason to keep me awake. Ask me something else. Not interested, Tamrat said, getting up and walking over to him. Now hold on, Snowflake, Ardov said. He looked up at her, and she stared back, almost as though she'd been slapped. There were a lot of things about rural culture I didn't understand, but I'd seen Tamrat, usually fearless and defiant, bend and almost break under the weight of her society's codes and traditions. I started to walk over to get between them when Tamret touched Ardov's arm, injecting him with something to render him unconscious. Almost immediately, his head slumped forward.
That may have been premature,
Dr. Roop said.
There's a chance that he could have helped us.
He made it pretty clear that he wanted to be conscious,
Tamret said.
And he still said he couldn't help Alice, so I think he was telling the truth. And while he's awake, he's dangerous.
Dr. Roop nodded thoughtfully. He probably agreed with her, but I guessed he didn't like her acting so impulsively. I watched as Tamret walked back to where she had been, sitting, but her expression was darker now, distracted, and she wouldn't meet my eye. No one would, and I knew what they were thinking, that I could have avoided this whole mess. Alice would still be hurt, maybe, but if I'd played things differently, Ardov would be back on Earth. He wouldn't know our plans, and the group would have one more superhero with which to carry out the operation. The only good news to come out of all of this was that the Fads hadn't guessed what we were up to yet, and that meant they wouldn't be waiting for us at the prison. It might well be that security would be tight everywhere, but we knew we wouldn't be walking into a trap. Or at least, they knew they wouldn't be walking into a trap. I'd be sitting on the ship, watching Ardov for signs of wakefulness, and listening to Vilonic complain.